Hey everyone! This video is going to be covering the material in the appendix that I asked you all to look at, the idea of argument diagramming. I figured it was a difficult enough concept that it would make sense to spend a good amount of time with it just on its own. So that's what we'll be doing today. Alright, so last time we talked about the idea of argument and standardization. Today when we're going to talk about diagramming, we're going to go a little bit beyond standardization. Diagramming is a little bit more powerful of a tool. It assumes standardization, so always begin there. But diagramming will allow us to understand how the various different parts of the argument fit together, how the premises are related to one another, and how they're related to the conclusion. This will be especially valuable and especially important when we look at more complicated arguments. So let's begin. Let's just look at some of the examples of arguments we looked at last class. Let's look at that first argument. Kara is a mammal because Kara is a cat and all cats are mammals. So last time we standardized the argument like this. Let's now diagram it. So first step, we put the conclusion up top. The two premises then will go underneath. Now this step right here, in more complicated arguments, you'll have a bit more work to do. But this one's pretty simple. Just as a general rule, conclusion goes on top, premises on the bottom. So you put our two premises on the bottom. The last step is to figure out how these two premises are related to one another and how they're related to the conclusion. There are two choices. There's two options. The premises and the can either be independently supporting the conclusion, or they have to work together, what's called linked or joint support, to establish the conclusion. And your task is to figure out which is which. We are looking at linked support or independent support. The procedure to figure this out, try to take each premise individually and see if it makes a sensible argument just on its own. So, for example, take the first premise, Kara is a cat, therefore Kara is a mammal. On its own, is that a sensible argument? I'm going to say that it actually isn't. Just in the abstract, there's no real connection between the idea of being a cat and being a mammal. You all might sort of know that there's that connection, right? And indeed, connection is what's being posited by the other premise, but you're sort of supplying it in. If I made it, Kara is a snorkelplek, right? Some animal you don't know anything about, you will have no idea if a snorkelplek or is not likely to be a mammal. So Kara is a cat, therefore Kara is a mammal. In and of itself, that doesn't work. It sort of presupposes additional information. What's the additional information? Well, okay, let's look at the second premise. All cats are mammals, therefore Kara is a mammal. Again, this doesn't work either. We don't know that Kara is a cat. If you knew that information, sure, but without that information, you don't have a sensible claim. The premise doesn't really give you any good reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So what we have here is an example of linked support. These two premises work together to establish the conclusion, and on their own, neither is fully adequate. So if we could prove either of the two premises false, the entire argument will sort of collapse. So we see that when arguments rely upon premises working together to establish the conclusion, and individually they don't work, we diagram that by sort of bracketing those premises and drawing a single line up to the conclusion. Let's look at a different example that we can contrast it with. Let's look at the second argument we looked at last time. So this argument, I studied hard for the test, I did all of the homework, I've done well on previous tests too, so I will probably do well on this test. And last time we standardized this argument in the following way. Again, this argument's going to be a little bit easier, so let's jump straight to the sort of key diagramming part. We'll put our conclusion up top, and we'll put our three premises underneath. What we need to do is the same test we did last time. Do these three premises give you independent reasons to believe that the conclusion is true, or just like last time, do they have to work together? And this time I think we're going to find that they actually work individually. They don't really require anything else. If I studied hard for the exam, then yeah, I indeed am likely to do well on it. If I did all the homework, yeah, that does indeed increase the chances that I'll do well in the exam. If I've done well in all the previous exams, yeah, that in and of itself is a reason to believe that I will do well in this one. So what we're looking at here is an example of independent support, and we'll show that by drawing each premise connected to the conclusion by an individual line. This is significant. These three premises certainly make the argument stronger if all of them are true. Each gives you a different reason. The more reasons you have to believe that the conclusion is true, the better. But let's say that one of these turns out not to be true. Let's say I actually really haven't done that well in the previous exams. Alright, that would eliminate sort of one branch of the argument. It would get rid of number 3, but it leaves the other 2 premises untouched. The other 2 premises still give us some reason to believe that the conclusion is true, even if the argument is a little bit weaker than it was. If we contrast that with the last case, if I eliminate either of the 2 premises, because they're joint support or link support, the entire argument will collapse. There'll be nothing left. So this is why it can be helpful to sort of do this diagramming. It helps us understand how the parts of the argument sort of stand or fall together. By the way, just as an aside, if you ever see an argument with only one premise, well, it's got to be independent support then, right? Nothing for it to join with. So any single premise by itself, you're going to have an instance of independent support. Alright, now diagramming gets more complicated as the arguments get a little bit more complicated themselves. So it'll become a little bit more challenging, you'll have a few more steps to do. Let's go back to that second argument, but let's add a little bit more to it. So let's change it slightly. Keep the first 4 sentences exactly the same. I studied hard for the test, I did all of the homework, I did well in the previous test, so I'll probably do well in this test too. As a result, so now this is something new that we've added, as a result, I can probably afford to go to a party tonight, despite the fact that I do have a test tomorrow. So we've added in one additional sentence at the end. Alright, well, let's even just start here, before we even begin diagramming. What's the actual conclusion in this argument? We seem to have 2 plausible candidates. Just on the basis of clue words, both the 4th and the 5th sentence feature conclusion clue words. So that's one hint. Also, we know because of the diagram we just did, that number 4 is supported, reasons are given to believe that number 4 is true by those first 3 premises. So maybe number 4 is still our conclusion. The problem with that is it's not really the case that that 5th sentence is a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. I can afford to go to a party tonight despite having a test tomorrow. That's not really a reason to believe I'll do well in the test. In fact, the opposite is true. If I have reason to believe that I'll do well in the test, that gives me a reason to believe that I can go to the party tonight. So in this case, what we're looking at is called an argument that contains subordinate arguments within it. A subordinate argument is where an argument has premises that give support not just to the conclusion, but some of the premises also give us reasons to believe that other premises are true. Right? So we defined earlier, a premise gives you a reason to believe that something is true. All the examples we've looked at so far are cases where the premises give you reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. In an argument that contains subordinate arguments within it, some premises give you reasons to believe that premises are true. So with that in mind then, now let's look at what the right way to go about standardizing this argument. So we now have 5 sentences, so 5 steps as opposed to 4. So the first 3 say the same. We now say that another premise is that 4th sentence, I will probably do well on the exam. And now our conclusion is this new thing that we've added in. As a result, I can probably afford to go to a party tonight. We're going to call those first 3 subordinate premises. They don't give you reasons to believe that the main conclusion is true. Instead, they give you reasons to believe that number 4 is true. And we're going to call number 4 a subordinate conclusion. It's not the primary conclusion. Each argument only has one primary conclusion. But it is a subordinate conclusion. It is supported by subordinate premises. We're also going to call 4, however, the primary premises that lead to the conclusion, because 4 gives us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So it's a much more complicated structure. We had to do a lot more work figuring out all the pieces, and this is what our resulting diagram will look like. It'll look very similar to the more simple case. We'll have 1, 2, and 3 giving us reasons to believe that 4 is true. And it's still independent, right? They still work individually. But now 4, rather than being the primary conclusion, 4 is now a premise that gives us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And so we diagram that like this. Unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule I can give you about how to figure out what's the primary premise when you have a subordinate argument, right, and what are the subordinate premises. It's frequently the case that you have to try a couple different options and go with the one that makes the most sense. Remember, though, that each individual portion of your diagram should make sense. So 1 really should give you an independent reason to support 4. 2 really should give you an independent reason to support 4. 3 really should give you an independent reason to support 4. And 4 really needs to give you an independent reason to support the conclusion. If you can really earnestly say all of those things, your diagram is going to work. Right? Whereas if you're just sort of throwing in sentences because you need to use all of them, and an individual piece doesn't really seem like it's working, you probably want to start over, maybe try to re-identify the conclusion, or rethink how you're seeing the argument is fitting together. And we'll definitely practice this in class. This is just a case where it's going to be really valuable to do a lot of practice problems. Alright, that'll do it for this week. We'll do lots of practice with this argument diagramming in class, and these are the first problems that I'm guessing, at least for some of you, you'll want to do a little bit more practice on. This is where the class will probably start getting a little bit harder. So we'll go over these together in class. Remember, you can always come to my office hours too if you're struggling with any of the problems. And I'll talk to you later. Bye!